Hello everybody, in this tutorial we're gonna speak about the cortical control of movement. We are going to speak about the primary motor cortex and the premotor cortex. We're gonna define where they are located, an anatomical view and also physiological view. What's the function of each area? So let's begin. I will try at the end of this tutorial to be able to answer this question. Can you? Let's see. First of all, we're gonna define the area where we have the primary motor cortex. First of all, to know where the primary motor cortex is located, we can define here these. I want to draw it with black now. This sulcus, which is called the central sulcus. The central sulcus is located here. Before the central sulcus, at this area, we have what we called the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is located before the central sulcus. The precentral gyrus is an anatomical name, but what is the physiological name to this area? The physiological name is primary motor cortex, or we can call it PM1, primary motor cortex. So that's with the red color here is the primary motor cortex, all these gyrus. This gyrus so is called the primary motor cortex. The motor control is divided to primary motor cortex and premotor cortex. We can divide the premotor cortex into three parts. First one, which we can call it the supplementary. The second one is the dorsal premotor cortex. And the third one is the ventral premotor cortex. So we said that this area here is the primary motor cortex. So where is the premotor cortex? The premotor cortex, it's before the primary motor cortex, at the frontal lobe. So here, this lobe is called the frontal lobe. This lobe is the occipital lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe here. So this lobe is the frontal lobe. So here we have the premotor cortex. We can say that at the end of the frontal lobe we have the premotor cortex. At the front of the primary motor cortex. Premotor cortex, as we said, is divided into three parts: supplementary, dorsal premotor, and ventral premotor. The supplementary premotor area is located at the medial part of the premotor cortex. So here, that's the supplementary motor area. The dorsal motor area is located in the dorsal surface of the precentral gyrus. So we can say this is the here precentral gyrus. The dorsal part of it, we have the dorsal premotor cortex. And here in the inferior part of the premotor cortex, here the posterior, we can say that the posterior part of the inferior frontal gyrus, here inferior frontal gyrus, the posterior part of it, where we have the premotor cortex, a part of the premotor cortex which is called the ventral premotor cortex. So in the inferior, in the posterior part of the inferior gyrus, or in the inferior part of the premotor cortex area. So now anatomically, we can define where these area are located. So now let's turn on to the function of each area. So let's begin with the primary motor cortex. We said that the primary motor cortex is located here. Let's remember where, here. It's the anterior wall of the central sulcus. Very few, here is the histological view, very few granular cells in the layer 4 and many large pyramidal cells in the layer 5. That's the layer 5 here. And when we do a zoom in, so we say we see PET cells here, and here we can see pyramidal cells, like these cells, pyramidal cells, so at the layer 5. There is also a division for each part of the cortical area, that's called the Brodmann areas. So each area has its own name. So the primary motor cortex is called the Brodmann area 4. Okay, so what is the function of this area? The function of it is to, here we can say, in the coordination of movement of the trunk and extremities. So for example, when we gonna play a piano, the area which is when we're learning to play a piano or to dancing in such a movement, the area that is responsible for that is the primary motor cortex. So the primary motor cortex. So the function of this area is it play a huge role in voluntary movement movement and skilled learning or skill learning. In particular skilled, like hand and finger movement. So that's the role of this area. Let's have a look here. So, coordinated movement of tracts and extremities. So here, when we stimulate the area 1 on the monkey, the area M1, the primary motor cortex, we said that the positive charge here initiate the beginning of the movement, and the red point here, the end of the movement, indicate the end of the movement. So we can say that it's a voluntary movement where the monkey move his hand toward his mouth. That's happen when we stimulate the primary motor cortex on the contralateral arm. And also when we have a light here, a green light, and we said, and when the monkey need to move the ball here toward the light, so also the cortex that is responsible for that is the primary motor cortex. So to summarize that, we can say that the primary motor cortex is responsible for the voluntary movement and skill learning and hand and finger movement. So now let's turn to another part, which is the dorsal motor cortex. We said that the dorsal, or we can begin with unknown. Yes, the dorsal motor cortex is located here in the superior part of the lateral view of the premotor cortex. This is the dorsal premotor cortex. The dorsal premotor cortex is located here in the dorsal lateral surface of the precentral gyrus. This is the precentral gyrus with here the dorsal. Imagine that the brain here, that's the top of the brain. So here it's a dorsal view. This is an external sensory, responsible for the external sensory guided behavior. How to remember that? Yes, we can say also that nearby this field we have visual eye, frontal eye field, or we can say frontal visual eye field or eye field. Here, the frontal eye field is responsible for the initiated movement. But nearby to it, the dorsal premotor cortex is responsible for the external guided behavior. External guided behavior, so For example, when we react to something, when we turn our face to look in the flash of something, the flash of a car, for example, or when a sound turn our attention to the sound, that's the dorsal premotor cortex where it's responsible for that. And I said that to remember that, we can relate that to the area which is nearby it, which is the frontal eye field. So there is an integration between these two areas. Of course, they are close to each other and related to each other. So we can call it the visual motor integration. Okay, the visual motor integration. And also this the frontal eye field, if we want, I said that it's responsible for initiated movement, and I mean by that self-initiated movement. I mean by that for example, if I want to look to the o'clock and there is no stimulus that say to me look to the o'clock, that's what I want, not for example a sound of the alert or something like that. So we said the dorsal premotor cortex is responsible for a selection of external guided behavior. Reaction, for example. To choose a movement based on a visual cue, here we say the premotor lateral, premotor dorsal division. Here where we have a lesion, I don't want to speak about that. So remember that the dorsal premotor cortex is nearby the frontal visual field. That's why there is a visual motor integration. And also the frontal eye field is responsible for self-initiated movement, but the area which is located near to it, which is the dorsal premotor cortex, is responsible for a selection of behavior that's based on the external cue. Now to the supplementary motor area, and I have a very good rule to you to remember it. The supplementary motor area is located in the medial part of the premotor cortex, and here we say that it's located here. It's an overview. Here we have supplementary motor area, and here we have also the supplementary motor area for the other hemisphere. So what could it be responsible for? Try to think about that. Bimanual coordination. Bimanual coordination. The location of it allow it to be a bimanual coordination part. Here, remember, bimanual coordination. And also, it's responsible for internal generated movement. Where it's located? It's located in here. Remember that it's responsible for internal initiated movement or internal generated, we can say also. Here they did like an experiment. where they give a task to the participant. One of the tasks is to touch a button which is that light up. That's external stimulus, so obviously, and the another task which is to perform a memorized sequence, and that's self-initiated movement or internal generated movement. What we see here at the internal generated movement here in 5 and 6 here, the area which is primarily responsible for that is the supplementary motor area. So that's like the cue for that. Last area here we have in this tutorial, be patient. This is very new discovery area, and it's important because the scientists discovered that in this area we react to the movement of other people. That's what we called mirror system. I want to explain that in this picture. Here in this picture, we see that in the vent here we have the human or will pick up the maybe food or something, pick up the food, and that's a record of the monkey brain, the ventral premotor area of monkey brain. And we see here that there is a firing of action potential in the ventral motor area, while the monkey just watching the human picking up. So he's learning, watching. And that's what we called mirror neurons. Mirror, that not just the actions that I do, but also my brain firing an action potential if we are watching other do something. And that's where the lateral the ventral division of the lateral part of the premotor cortex is responsible for that. So that's where we understand other actions, where we learn. Okay, so to summarize that, the primary motor cortex is responsible for voluntary movement, skill learning, in particular hand and finger movement. Here we have the premotor cortex, which we divided to the dorsal premotor cortex and the ventral premotor cortex and the supplementary premotor cortex. Let's begin with the dorsal premotor cortex, which was responsible for the visual motor integration and selection of movement based on the sensory cues. We said that its location allow it to do this role, visual motor integration. We have also the supplementary motor cortex, and also the location remind us of the bimanual coordination and internal generated movement. So that's the function of supplementary motor area. The ventral motor cortex is a key region. It's a new discovery and a key region in the mirror system. I hope that this tutorial is useful to you, and see you in next tutorial, and good luck.